So this video focuses on the excerpt I gave you from Plato's Phaedo, from the dialogue. I think that really the Platonic conception of the immortal soul can be very profitably compared to the conception of the self in the Bhagavad Gita, and that these two texts help each other, or they help us to understand each other, and they can be read very nicely together. They do differ from each other. I mean, if we look at the Bhagavad Gita, it doesn't have arguments in the classical Western sense of arguing for a position. What we have here in the Phaedo is an utterly kind of non-religious attempt to argue that there is something called the immortal soul, and that this soul survives death. The Bhagavad Gita is a revelation. I mean, what we saw, or if you look at that text, what we have are two characters talking to each other, one of whom is a god. My understanding is that you have this warrior Krishna, and then you have his charioteer, who is the embodiment of the god Krishna, and Krishna decides to teach Arjuna, who's got this difficulty about what to do, whether to fight this war. And he reveals the truth. And it's an utterly rational thing. I mean, it's not as if it's just pure mysticism or poetry or something. No, it's a rational view of reality and of the human being and of what's important and what's real and what's not real. But it's a revelation. It's a showing. It's a teaching from an authority, from a divine authority. Whereas what we have here is merely a human being, Socrates, who is trying to prove a point. It's a very personal dialogue. As I said in the introduction to this unit, it takes place, at least dramatically, and this is something written by Plato, who was a young friend of Socrates, and he wrote it years later. So whether or not it actually reflects any actual conversation that Socrates had with his friends before he drank the hemlock, we don't know. But Socrates is about to be killed. I mean, he's going to, I guess literally, he's going to commit suicide, but that's just the form of execution, is drinking the hemlock, drinking the poison. So it's a very personal thing, and the dialogue itself, if you read the whole thing, is very rich and dramatic and has these ups and downs, and it's very emotional because these men love Socrates and they know that this is the last day of his life. So there's something really at stake dramatically in the background of this dialogue. It's not an abstract, it's not merely an abstract discussion of the issue of the immortality of the soul. It's a very pressing importance to the people in the room because of the circumstances, because they all know that Socrates will be dying in a very short time. So what I've given you is, I think, a really key excerpt, something manageable, to do in an accelerated class, but very compact, and gives you, I think it's important to understand that there are three separate arguments here that Socrates gives, and you might want to mark them out in the text. Each one of them is meant to support the idea that there is something called an immortal soul, or there is an aspect to the human being that we can confidently expect will survive death. The first argument is the argument from opposites, and we'll look at that. That's the notion that everything that is generated, that's important to note, everything that comes to be, everything that comes into existence from its opposite, which is an interesting and kind of puzzling thing to say, but we'll be looking at the details, and that if life and death are opposites, then they come from each other. That is, that the dead come from the living, and death comes from life. And that life also comes from death, that the living come from the dead, which is, of course, a more difficult thing to try to establish. After that, in the middle, there's a distinct argument having to do with a very famous theory of Plato's, a theory of recollection, a theory of knowledge as recollection, and this idea of the forms or essences, as they're called in this translation, which is a distinct and very important argument, not only in this context, but for the entire Platonic philosophy, having to do with what is real and how we know what is real, and the ultimate nature of truth, and what is really true, things like that. And then finally, there is an argument about the nature of the soul, which is, I think, our most important argument. The idea that I think it's sometimes called the argument from Affinity, and it really does depend upon the previous argument, from the second argument regarding the forms or essences, and is an argument about the nature of the soul, about what kind of thing the human soul is, and on the basis of an understanding of what kind of thing the human soul is, various inferences are made by Socrates about whether it's the kind of thing that could possibly die. And the connection, again, with the Bhagavad Gita is, I think, very, very rich here. So the important thing to look at in this reading, I think, first of all, is to understand there are these three separate arguments. The argument from opposites, the description or argument about the theory of recollection, of knowledge as recollection, and then finally the argument about the nature of the soul or intellect. There are three distinct arguments, and it may be that on a first reading it seemed like they're just sort of thrown out there as three different stabs at trying to tackle this question about the immortality of the soul, but they are subtly, I think, related, and I'll try to bring that out in the individual videos on the different arguments.